much diagnostic value. But because it concentrates the body's biochemical castaways, it can also serve as an indicator of what is off balance. And in Sam's case, it was his pancreas. Rather than simply wiping the puddle away, a nurse noticed that the urine smelled sweet and decided to stick a test strip into the mess on the table, just in case. What she found changed the Meltons' lives, and quite possibly the course of stem cell science. Sam's urine was full of ketones. For hours, and possibly days, his body had come dangerously close to shutting down in a desperate and ultimately futile search for the insulin that it needed to keep all of his metabolic functions going. When his cells couldn't find any, his body began burning up its own fat stores and releasing the acidic ketones as a byproduct. It wasn't that he hadn't been fed. He had. But his body was starving. He was consuming glucose, but his pancreas wasn't making enough insulin to break it down from the milk he was drinking. Sam was diabetic. In retrospect, it's such an obvious diagnosis, and the doctors at a leading children's hospital might have considered the possibility that Sam was suffering from a buildup of ketones in his blood much sooner. But diabetes doesn't normally show up in infants so young. In fact, at the time, Sam was the youngest baby on record diagnosed with the disease in the hospital's 122-year history. Once the diagnosis was confirmed, the medical team acted fast. Nurses inserted an IV with insulin into his tiny arm, and, says O'Keefe, within 24 hours in intensive care, he was on his hands and knees and he was nursing. He was a baby again. It was just the most amazing thing in the world. A little insulin. It was an incredibly dramatic presentation of this disease that we knew nothing about. But she and her husband quickly learned. The diagnosis certainly gave Sam a very different life from the one his parents had envisioned. He would always be dependent on outside sources of insulin hormone to compensate for what his body could not make. He would have to keep careful track of what he ate and how much energy he expended to make sure his body was getting the right amount of glucose at the right time. The diagnosis changed Melton and O'Keefe's lives as well. Melton had been trained as a biologist, and while he was a scientist, not a physician, he knew what lay ahead for his baby son. Years of constant finger pricks to check the sugar in his blood, and repeated insulin shots to mop up the excess that his body could no longer process. O'Keefe became, in essence, her son's pancreas, developing almost a sixth sense for when he needed more insulin, in the middle of the night or after an exhausting afternoon of soccer practice, or for when his insulin levels had climbed too high and he needed a candy bar to soak up the overflow. The week that Sam was diagnosed, Melton put his research duties in the lab on hold and stayed home with his wife, daughter, and son. Those days following Sam's diagnosis, he says, were a horrific time, not one I like to remember. A professor in developmental biology at Harvard University, Melton was already well known and respected for his work on early amphibian development. Frog embryology, not human development, was his specialty. But after Sam returned home from the hospital, Melton was haunted by the constant blood checks and insulin injections in Sam's future. In his worst moments, he confronted the possibility that even with the most vigilant care, Sam could have severe health problems as he reached adolescence and adulthood. He knew that a bottomed-out blood sugar could lead to blackouts, organ failure, even blindness or amputations. He considered all of this and came to a realization. I was not going to just sit around, he tells me as he relives that painful day as we talk in his office on the Harvard campus. I was going to do something. If a cure didn't exist for type 1 diabetics like Sam, Melton and O'Keefe decided, then Melton would find one, or at least try. As radically different as amphibians are from humans, Melton's shift wasn't as preposterous as it initially seemed. Both involved a similar appreciation for the intricate choreography of development, an understanding of what drives a cell to turn on certain genes and turn off others as it maps out its fate. Compared to the changes his son would face, Melton determined the career turnaround was not such a